Okay, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the court is now in session. Dave, welcome back. It's good to chat with you again, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So what I want to do is, because you did this amazing job on first kind of a lengthy blog post that you wrote last year that you wrote in January, I think, of this year, that you recently updated about why you think Craig Wright is Satoshi, and you referenced this court case, the Wright v. Kleiman. But you linked to a very lengthy, it's like 13 pages, I think, PDF, where you kind of go through a synopsis of this case and what you think and what do these things mean. And so I want to talk about this case today, Craig Wright versus Ira Kleiman court case, and get a breakdown of what exactly is the case about. Like, I think a lot of people know in a general sense, myself included, from just following little clips and snips here and there, but there's so much noise and everyone wants to make this case about what they want to make it about. And everything that happens with this case has like 5 different people claiming that it proves their point.
Right.
It's like the one thing I do know about law is that there's almost never something that unequivocally proves someone's point, especially if it's just like one person's testimony during one part of the deposition or whatever. So it seems like a lot of stuff is overblown. So anyway, if you don't, if you want to add any other context or framing, or actually let me start with this. What made you decide to kind of put this synopsis together? And then what was the process of doing it? I mean, did you read through every single published court document, or what was that like?
Yeah. So Jack, another partner at the fund, initially wrote the piece last December, and it was just necessary to write because as we're fundraising, as we're talking to people, we want to talk about, look at all this awesome stuff that's being built on Bitcoin, but they always want to go like, okay, but what about Craig Wright? That's the elephant in the room. So like we had to address it. So we're going to, let's make this blog post. Let's do a thorough job. Let's kind of just lay out our case, which we thought like wasn't crazy, just like think about the different incentives of the different people. Let's look into some of the actual evidence and just put it out there. And after we did that, it became our most shared post by far. A lot of people were reading it, even high profile people like Mike Cernovich retweeted it. And a lot of people were interested in the story. And then recently with all the stuff coming out from Discovery and Kleiman v. Wright, we just had a lot more specifics. So we had kind of a vague sense of why we thought Craig was Satoshi. And it was largely just due to like these different incentives, like why would this guy lie, and kind of the high level stuff. But the details from Kleiman v. Wright helped us flesh it out. So I did a lot of the work. Other guys at my fund also spent time. We were just reading thousands of pages of depositions. I mean, there's a treasure trove of information if you're interested in this from the court listener, like .gov website. It's all like, legit documents. And we weren't finding it from the crypto media. So every once in a while, you'd see somebody report on the case. The general reporting was Craig's being sued for fraud, fake Toshi. That wasn't satisfying because just like initially from looking into the case, oh yeah, he's being sued for fraud, and the alleged fraud is that he's only half a Satoshi and not all of Satoshi, and he's cutting out his partner. So that's been conveniently omitted. So we weren't satisfied with what we were able to read, so we wanted to do it ourselves. And it's kind of culminated in this recent piece, which one of the more veteran guys at our fund always criticizes Jack and I for writing too long of pieces. We always want to like bust out this 20-page document.
Hey,
so this
tell
one,
him that from my perspective, that's what I love about Unbounded, is that you're one of the few places where it's not just like, here's a quick synopsis, you can learn more. And then there's never any way to, like, you guys actually, I can go and I can get the full story from you. So I like that.
I mean, yeah, you saw that with our ebook, right? That started out as an article and we were like, let's make a book. So I think you do lose some of your readership, but with this piece, like it's relatively readable in its length, but it's very hyperlinked, as you pointed out. So if you're curious, you can click on these links and they'll bring into, additional 13-page documents that themselves link to other documents. So we wanted to put it all together and give a full summary of how we understand the case.
The court would like to call on Mr. Patterson and request an explanation for his tardiness.
I set up this trust several years ago.
This Zoom link was nested within several other Zoom links.
Right.
Yeah. And some fishy business happens. Well, I'm not going to go into the details, but if you press me too hard, I might have to sue you. So we'll just have to end it there.
Well, no, I'm glad you joined, Steve. I'm not sure TK and or Derek may or may not join as well, but we're gonna jump in with just going on to this court case, and I'm kind of working from a 13-page PDF that I mentioned. So if you're listening or watching this and you want to know more, unboundedcapital.com/blog, they have a "Why We Think Craig Wright is Satoshi and Why That Matters" post, which is if you want kind of like the high level. But in the opening of that post, they say, we also put together extensive research on the specifics of this trial, which you can find here. And they link to it. And that's the PDF link there. Oh, it's 11 pages is what I'm going to kind of use this as a guidepost for some of the questions that I want to ask as we work through this case. And Steve, you can obviously at any time interject and ask Dave, since he is the resident expert on Wright v. Kleiman. So,
and if you read the PDF, you're reading a file on chain, which is always fun too.
Oh, I didn't even know. Oh, you're right. Media.bitcoinfiles.org. I didn't even notice that.
It's so fun to use that.
See,
I love.
That's how Bitcoin should be. You don't even notice that you're using it.
And it's timestamped too. So if we are vindicated, it'll look nice that it's buried under, 100,000 blocks.
I like it. Unless somebody hacked your system, and okay, we won't get into that. All right. So I'm going to read the executive summary, if that's cool, and then. And then we'll jump in. Okay, so the executive summary here says, details surrounding the identity of Satoshi Nakamoto and the origins of Bitcoin have emerged from a Florida court case, Kleiman v. Wright. The plaintiff, Ira Kleiman, is suing the defendant, Craig Stephen Wright, CSW, for the rights to Bitcoin tokens and Bitcoin-related intellectual property. Ira alleges that his deceased brother, Dave Kleiman, was CSW's partner in the development of Bitcoin and Bitcoin-related IP. Implicit in this allegation is that CSW created Bitcoin and has access to Satoshi's Bitcoins, currently valued at somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 billion. CSW has made it clear that his intention is to sell his BTC in favor of his preferred version of Bitcoin, BSV, which is more aligned with the original vision. If this occurs, it would have massive market ramifications of the orders of hundreds of billions of dollars. Court case details support CSW's claim to be Satoshi. This contrasts the opinion of many industry leaders who don't believe that CSW is Satoshi or that he can follow through in his threats to sell BTC for BSV. The conflict around the Satoshi identity ties into a larger conflict around the purpose of Bitcoin and the role of law in Bitcoin. So that's kind of, for those who are like, why are you so obsessed with this court case and whatever, like, this actually is a very big deal for all of Bitcoin, for BSV, for BTC. It's not just sort of celebrity gossip. Like, regardless of the outcome of the case, things that can come out in it or things that may happen because of it have a lot of ramifications across the network, potentially. And
this is also the second part. So you asked why we wrote this. Part of it was that we were unsatisfied with what existed, and we wanted to address the elephant in the room for people that were curious. But also, we need to know this stuff as investors. We have, it would be very irresponsible for us to be investing our investors' money into the Bitcoin SV space and not be up to date with this case. So that's kind of the second part of why we did the research. And then once you do the research, you may as well publish it.
But by the way, that's one of the things I think makes your content so much better. I mean, there are times where some of the stuff you guys write about Craig, I'm like, it feels a little too glowing. But for the most part, unlike most people who like BSV or think that Craig is maybe telling the truth, or at least part of the truth, you have a fiduciary duty to be right about your predictions, because you have investors in your fund and you're trying to make investment decisions and allocate resources, and you lose money if you're wrong. And so you tend to present the material in a more objective way. And I think you just have a good lens on it because of that. So skin in the game, good thing.
Speaking of being too glowing of CSW, here's TK.
Hey, there he is. There's our, the court would like to call upon Takoa Coleman and ask for an excuse for your tardiness.
I've got some backup now.
He's not even going to say anything.
Maybe not. Yeah, maybe I don't.
What up, TK?
Hey, I don't have to prove anything to any of you guys.
Okay, so TK, you can jump in with questions anytime as well, as we're just getting started. So Dave, let's start with why would this court case come about? So what are the possible explanations for why Ira Kleiman would sue Craig Wright? I think there are like maybe 2 or 3 potential explanations, but I think all of them are interesting. Why do you think this would come about in the first place?
So I think a point that's a point of agreement between the plaintiff and the defendant is that Craig reached out to Ira's father, Dave's father, just saying, hey, you know, Dave was a friend of mine. He was involved in this Bitcoin stuff, and I wanted to let you know. So why Craig did that, you know, who knows? It might just be a great example of no good deed goes unpunished, or maybe, you know, there's other things to it. But the way that Craig frames it is kind of, he reached out, he felt an obligation to rope the family into this. He was in discussions.
Did he promise them that he would give them some money or something? Or did he just
there was
say,
no promise
hey,
of money. It was kind of like you might want to know, which kind of makes sense if this, you know, from Craig's point of view, this is who I think he says he's his best friend. I think he uses that term. His best friend passes away. He doesn't have much, you know, he was like struggling financially. Doesn't have much to his name to say like, hey, this Bitcoin thing was partially, he was involved with it. Is a really nice thing to say to his father after he passes away. So it's possible. But you can tell this from email exchanges between Craig and Ira, some of which alleged to be fraudulent, but in general, the gist is like, it starts out as a good conversation, initially with Ira's dad, who has since passed away, and then with Ira. And eventually it looks like Ira is interested in gaining access to some of these assets, which Craig is offering. And part of that is not like Bitcoin that was mined. It was shares of a company called Coin Exchange, which I think is undisputed that Dave was a 49.5% equity stakeholder in. So there's discussion about this, and Ira's angle is kind of, yeah, I'm interested obviously in this windfall, but I don't really want to pay tax on it. Is there a way that I cannot pay tax? Or is there a way I can have exposure to the upside? Because Craig was kind of saying, we're not going to like wrap up these companies. These are ongoing entities. So it's not just going to be like a cash payment. So Ira kind of wants exposure to the upside without the risk of having equity in a volatile company. So the conversation breaks down there.
For some framing that, you know, that could sound like, oh my gosh, what a like selfish, you know, whatever. But it's very rational. Like if somebody approached me and said, hey, you know, you had some rich uncle you never knew about. He died. He had shares in this company. We're still operating the company, but you own like 50% of the shares. And I'd be like, okay, what can I do with those? Well, nothing. If we eventually sell, you can make a ton of money, but we might go bust. And I'd say, well, okay, I don't know anything about this company. I can't do anything to improve it. Can I sell now? Sure, you can sell now. We'll buy you out for this price. And I don't know if it's a good price. And I would have a massive tax on that. And I might think, well, maybe can I get like some of it out now somehow with like minimal taxes and then keep some in there for the upside? Like that's a fairly rational thing to start to kind of try to analyze what your options are.
Right. Yeah. And then there was also discussions, and I don't have everything pulled up with me, and I'm going to forget some details because I've read thousands of pages of things, but there was some discussions about Craig offering just to buy him out. And he wasn't, you know, he was kind of concerned that Craig was using this information asymmetry to kind of swindle him, which, you know, very reasonable. But yeah, the general thing was he wants cash. He wants it now. He's not interested in being on the board. He doesn't really want anything to do with the company. He just is interested in the cash, and ideally tax-free, obviously.
Okay. So scenario one of of Ira suing is he finds out that his brother has all this stuff and he's like, I'm privy to it. And Craig says, well, you know, like I'll give you some stuff, but you're not privy to as much as you think you are. And he says, yes, I am. I'm going to sue you. That's scenario one. I have some doubts about that. It seems maybe a little bit far-fetched that like, you know, especially given what it takes to go into a court case and all the costs and all that stuff, you would think that Ira would have his people look and be like, well, it looks like here's what you can prove. So go just ask him for what you can provably get and get it. And we're good to go. And just kind of like taking a guess and being like, you know what? I think that I'm owed more than you, and I don't have enough evidence to prove it, but I think I am. Like, let's go ahead. I don't know. That seems crazy. Not crazy, but that seems a little bit of a stretch. But
yeah,
another scenario is that Ira is actually doing this as a favor to Craig because Craig is looking for a pretext to bring a bunch of stuff out in court. So they could be colluding behind the scenes somehow as a way.
I like the 5D chess explanations.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then yet another scenario is there's somebody else who really doesn't like Craig and has come to Ira and said, hey, we'll pay for it. We want you to be the plaintiff here and sue Craig Wright. And because there's several potential reasons, right? If Craig is correct about all the things that he's saying and, then trying to mire him or delay his ability to move those coins because he's caught in a court case or whatever, could be beneficial to several parties. But when you see the various, we're like, what is the scenario that you think is the most plausible?
Well, and like to further on that scenario, the lawsuit is being financed by a couple of companies. And one of them, I forget the name of it, but it's like, they have like a good website and this is what they do. And then the other one is like an LLC that was just registered in Delaware, and it's called like BTC and then like 8 numbers. So it's like, they're financing this somehow. And Ira did receive cash after this had started. I forget when it was, but he's not like a rich guy. And he had this house and then he bought a house with cash without selling his first house shortly after, I think right after this litigation started. So like he did receive money somehow. That was kind of a discussion in some of his depositions. And there are people financing it, and like I'll preface the whole interview that I'm not a legal expert. So I don't know what's standard and what's not. I'm just like looking at this very much as a layman.
So it's possible that he saw an opportunity and said, oh, Craig has enemies. Let me go get somebody to finance this and give me money. But it seems more likely that somebody on the other side saw an opportunity and came to him.
And reached out to him. Yeah, it's possible. Also, so predating all this, well, I guess there's 2 important things. One is that Ira was previously in another lawsuit against some former business partners of Dave's, Patrick Page and Carter Conrad. And he alleged them of kind of stealing the same Bitcoin that he thinks Dave had ownership to, some of the like early mined Satoshi Bitcoin. And that has so during his first deposition, that was ongoing. And then during his second deposition, that had been resolved. So
where those lawsuits started, do you know?
I believe in Florida, and I looked into, because Florida is like an open document state, and I tried to find more information on it, and I haven't been able to.
Do you remember the dates? Like,
so we don't know what the result of those cases was.
I mean, I've heard, but I haven't like corroborated. I heard that he lost. I don't know what that means. So if you have information on that, please comment it.
So losing could mean that the judge said, yeah, these guys have these coins and they don't owe them to you, or no, we can't even prove that these people have these coins that you were claiming with Dave's. So,
or just like no grounds for the case, or like some settlement. I mean, I guess it could mean anything.
So I'm guessing that it's something like when Craig reached out to him, then Ira turned around and said, okay, are there any other business connections that Dave had? And the idea is he found one and then started a lawsuit with these guys.
It was even more direct than that. So it was, Craig reaches out, he says like, hey, Dave was involved in this Bitcoin thing. You might want to like look at his hard drives. And like Dave famously had this USB stick that was like indestructible that he'd wear around his neck everywhere he went. So like presumably something important is on there. But there was all these different hard drives in his house, and Ira, as the like executor of the estate, was in charge of handling all this stuff. And so he actually does have some computer background. He's not like a computer forensics expert by any means. So since Dave was and his business partners were computer forensic experts, he sent hard drives to them saying like, hey, can you find any like of these types of files on there? So I think like the sense I get is that he was alleging they did, and they just didn't tell him about it, and they like made off with the Bitcoin. So I think, yeah, he was just like alleging shenanigans with Dave's property that he'd given to them.
I see. So this was the story of sending the hard drives off to some experts and then like not getting them back, or they claim they were destroyed or something like that.
Yeah, and like Craig is kind of coaching him in the process too. He was like, look for these types of files in their initial emails. But I think he was just like, well, I'll send this to Patrick Page. And Patrick Page was deposed in this also, so that's online.
Very interesting. Okay, so we have the case, and both parties. Now, I don't know a lot about how this works in the legal system, but both parties are claiming that Craig is part of Satoshi, and the debate is how much of Satoshi was Dave, if any, and therefore how much is he owed. But they both are claiming Craig is part of Satoshi. Craig has ownership of all of these Satoshi coins. And now it's just whether we can determine if Dave also has ownership of some of those in his estate. Would in a case like that, if the whole thing was fabricated and Craig never had any of it in the first place, would a judge like go through some discovery and then be like, look, this isn't even true in the first place. We're throwing this whole case out. Like, I'm not sure exactly how the legal system works. Like to me, it doesn't, I would guess that a judge would not be very willing to take this very far if it could be proven pretty quickly that Craig never had any of that to begin with.
Yeah, so I'm not sure the exact like legal process, but I think there is a version of that. And then there also is a version of, let's not have this go to a jury because it's just so obviously fraud. So like, let's just have I think it's called summary judgment, just rule on it. And that was Ira's most recent legal strategy. So he wanted a summary judgment and the judge just said like, you didn't meet the burden of proof. Like it's pretty high, obviously, burden of proof to not go to a jury. But throwing the whole thing out because like on its grounds, both sides are kind of insane. I would imagine that exists. I don't know what that's called or if that was looked at, but yeah, I mean, we're 2 years into this. This is kind of the real deal. Yeah.
Yeah. Like the idea of, I'm sure this has happened before, but of two parties, both spending tons of time and resources on a court case that both know to be superfluous for performative reasons.
Yeah. That's the 5D chess.
Yeah. Or vindictive strategy. Like I'm sure that's happened before, but it would be, I don't know. That'd be quite a thing.
I mean, interestingly enough, like, so no one that's adamantly in the CSW is a fraud camp, like of the crypto consensus viewpoint, really makes that case. At least I haven't heard that, like they're in cahoots and this is all a ruse. But I think it's actually like more likely that that's the case than what they think, which is
I feel like it would have to be because like otherwise
there's so much
if it was so
on
obvious
both sides.
If it was so obvious that Craig was a fraud, why would Ira be spending all this time?
I thought the crypto consensus was that they were in cahoots. I mean, I don't know. You tell me.
Yeah, I mean, like that hasn't been my experience. Usually, like so this is a thing that we wrote in the initial why we think Craig is Satoshi post in December. It was just like when you talk to someone that is convinced Craig is a fraud, they just haven't played it through. Like they just don't know what the fraud is, when it's going to pay off, how it's benefiting him. They really just like haven't investigated that. So like my experience
it's like they don't have any explanation for Ira.
No, it's just like Craig is a fraud, and like I feel good about that because everyone agrees, and the crypto media agrees.
And because if you listen to an interview with Craig or whatever, it's just an easy conclusion to come to because he just says a lot of stuff. He's kind of wild and offensive, and he doesn't finish all of his thoughts, and he makes outrageous claims, and so it's easy to be like everybody else says that they all seem calm and reasonable. He seems kind of crazy. Yeah, there's no way this guy can be right. So,
and that was the like exact process for me. I may have mentioned this in the last time that we were on, but I remember just the moment when I was like entertaining the idea that maybe Craig wasn't a fraud. And I just watched a video of his. I really hadn't watched many videos. And I was watching it and I was like, this guy is like so ridiculous. Like, what is he saying? The techno babble is off the charts. And then just like explicitly like to myself, I thought, okay, rewatch it, but he's Satoshi. And just like that little like switch, I watched it and I was like, oh, this is really interesting. I'm learning things now. So it's just like once you can kind of flip it.
Especially pre like 2017, like anything you watch of his before then, especially if you flip on okay, now let's imagine that this is Satoshi. It seems quite plausible. Okay.
I don't even know how the explanation. So if Craig is a fraud, which I think is, definitely a possibility here, I don't know what the explanation would be for Ira if he's not in on it. Like that doesn't even make sense to me. Craig's a fraud and
okay, well, it could be this.
Give me the theory.
Okay, it could be Craig is a fraud. He never had access to this stuff. He can't admit that because either he and Kelvin are in on it together, or he's continuing to trick Kelvin, or they're tricking all their BSV bag holders. And so he's willing to spend money to continue to pretend that this is true and come up with all these crazy excuses, the why he lost his hard drive and, you know, his dog ate his homework and whatever else. Ira, he doesn't care. He knows that Craig is a fraud, but he has some good-hearted crypto Bitcoin people who want to once and for all expose Craig as a fraud behind him. And they're saying, let's sue him as if he is Satoshi. And it's just going to force this whole charade. And he's going to be like, oh, I am Satoshi, but I can't give you the coins. Sorry.
Yeah,
and then it's going to just expose him for the fraud.
Wait, and then what's the payoff for Ira? Exposing him as a fraud, you're saying?
Yeah, so the payoff for Ira is he's getting paid by Core or whoever. And, but to finally rid themselves of Craig Wright once and for all. Get, you know, BSV is less valuable. And in a market where, you know, even with the market caps as small as they are, that's a win on the order of potentially billions in value, and you know, makes it worth funding it for somebody who's got a lot of holdings.
The difficulty with that one is why Craig would have started this by emailing Ira in the first place. I mean,
right.
Yeah.
So a lot of the evidence that I think we'll get into makes it very difficult to explain if Craig is a fraud and is lying about having these coins and being part of Satoshi. Many of his behaviors from like 2010, 11, 12, 13 are very, very hard to explain. Like it's either the longest con in history with like elaborate planning, or there's something else going on.
Well, one more thing I just wanted to say, and then on that his craziness does make sense though in the context of he and Ira working together, and this could be right. I haven't dug into it since our last conversation we had on it, but if this is part of an elaborate tax fraud, and there was some rebates or credits in the order of millions from the Australian tax authorities, then this lawsuit could make sense if Ira's in on it as well. But I just wanted to say one point that I've heard brought up from people who are very strongly in the BSV camp, that the fact that both parties agree that Craig was part of Satoshi is 0% evidence of Craig being Satoshi, or even being more plausibly Satoshi, because both parties have a vested interest in that. In all scenarios that you play out, Ira has no interest in saying that Craig is not part of Satoshi. And if Craig is a fraud, Craig obviously has an interest in saying that he is Satoshi. So it's not like, oh, well, both parties agree, therefore he really is Satoshi. It's like, well, that doesn't get you anywhere.
I mean, I make that point because that's usually news to people that are like superficially following this. So like, I think people that think they have an understanding of the case don't realize that the plaintiff is alleging Craig invented Bitcoin. So
most people think that Craig is being sued by Ira
for being a liar.
And they're Ira's goal.
That's just so low level,
though. Not Satoshi.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm like surprised that's like the dominant narrative, but like from my experience, that is what most people think. And then the other interesting thing is not just like so I think you're right about the incentives, that makes sense, but also just all of the witnesses and all of the exhibits submitted corroborate this from both sides. And like for the purposes of the case, some things look bad for Craig, but even the things that look bad for Craig look good for Craig and Satoshi. So like,
is that the case though? I mean, when you say all of the witnesses lend credibility to the idea that Craig is Satoshi, that seems like a pretty strong.
Okay, hold
claim.
that. Like, we're gonna start going down a couple of the key witnesses and pieces. But before we do, I just want to read this one small part. This is in this document, likely outcomes of the trial, and I think this is pretty interesting. That your take on this, Dave. It's uncertain who will win the case. That said, we believe either outcome will show that CSW played a role in the creation of Bitcoin as Satoshi Nakamoto, and that CSW will be able to use his substantial Bitcoin-related assets to promote BSV at the expense of BTC and BCH. We think it is likely that CSW will win the court case based on the difficulty to achieve the burden of proof required for Ira Kleiman and the lack of clarity from existing exhibit documents and testimony we have reviewed. However, we think that the resolution of this court case, regardless of which party wins, will be more significant for the broader market than the exact details of the legal outcome. So I think that's interesting that you think this case is really important and the resolution of the case itself is a big deal. but you feel that it's likely Craig will win because you just don't think the burden of proof has been met from the stuff that Ira has provided to show that Kleiman deserves 50% of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think in many ways, and maybe this is a very cynical tactic, but the well has been poisoned on a lot of information that's been submitted. And a lot of both sides are saying like, well, this document is not legitimate, this document is. And like, if you're reading it as a CSW hater or CSW lover, you'll like believe it. He's always, the fraudulent document always looks bad for him or vice versa. So I think meeting the preponderance of evidence threshold is difficult given that reality. And then the other thing is just Ira, and this was like a big takeaway when I was reading Ira's 2 depositions, is he just really has like no understanding of what's going on and very, very little basis for the claims that he's making. So like basically all of the information he has about Bitcoin and about what assets he thinks Dave owns comes from Craig. And then at the same time, he's saying, well, Craig is like lying and a fraud in all these other ways. So it's just like, and if you read the deposition, it's just like, it's pretty shocking how little information he has, which actually does lend more credibility to like the puppet master behind the scene funding everything. But it just seems like he doesn't have a strong case.
When you said, part of the reason you think that Ira might not win is because there's so much documentation and evidence that's in dispute by both parties. There's all kinds of, we've seen tons of these where this is a document submitted with 10,000 other documents. And then later Craig's like, oh, well, that's not mine. And they're like, well, your party submitted it. And he's like, well, we didn't look, we just submitted everything that we had on this hard drive and someone tampered with it. You said that's been the case with both sides. Do you have some examples? I wasn't aware of the Kleiman side. Have they submitted evidence that they later said, oh, wait a minute, we can't vouch for the credibility of this?
I'd have to go back and look for things that they submitted, but there's definitely documents that they just say, this is like a fabrication. I'm trying to remember what those are.
And the court has basically said that about several documents, right? Like, okay, well, we can't use this as evidence because it was backdated, or we can't use this as evidence.
Well, there's a lot of things in dispute about, so like, I'm just trying to like think on the fly here. One of the things I write about in that piece is Jonathan Warren, the BitMessage guy. And so Craig has BitMessages that I guess are beneficial to his claim that he did it alone. And they predate BitMessage's public release. And so the plaintiffs brought in Jonathan Warren, the inventor of BitMessage, to kind of be like, well, yeah, this is obviously a fabricated piece of evidence because BitMessage wasn't out and Craig couldn't have had access to it prior to its release. And that whole discussion like starts out looking really bad for Craig. And then it just gets really weird at the end when Warren just starts contradicting himself during the cross-examination from Craig's lawyers. So there's things that Ira brings that look very questionable for sure. I think most of it is from Craig and things that he submitted, and then him saying that was from a compromised server and I turned it over because I had a legal obligation to. But
can you elaborate just on the BitMessage thing? I hadn't heard the end of that story. That was interesting.
Yeah, so basically Jonathan Warren says, I forget the dates, but BitMessage was released on like January 1st, let's say. And Craig has submitted BitMessage evidence from like November, 2 months prior. And Jonathan Warren is saying, or the plaintiffs brought in Jonathan Warren to kind of corroborate their claim that this is evidence that Craig forged these BitMessages. And Craig is saying, no, it was actually, I had access to the software prior to its release, and it was accessible in this way. And the questioning with Warren gets weird because, well, for one, it's very clear that he is like in the BTC community. So his incentive to falsify this is pretty obvious. And he's very uncooperative with CSW's lawyers when they're saying like, he's been going to Bitcoin meetups for 9 years and he doesn't remember anyone's name he's dealt with. And he's just like not really cooperating. But the weird thing is when earlier in the deposition, he says like he's never communicated with Satoshi, he's never communicated with Craig Wright. And then later, Craig's lawyers produce an email between him and Craig Wright where he was asking Craig for a security audit on BitMessage. And Craig's lawyer says like, well, do you dispute this document? And he says, no. So it's like,
what?
It's very weird. Yeah. So like when I was reading it, I was like, oh, this looks bad for Craig. This is like cryptographically, something that you can kind of trace. And that was kind of the whole point of BitMessage. But then at the end, he just seems totally untrustworthy because one of like his financial incentive and also social incentive. And then two, because of just like totally incompatible claims about communicating with Craig.
So he was caught in a couple lies about other things, not necessarily, there wasn't proof brought that yes, BitMessage was available prior to this, but his testimony came into question based on some of his other dishonesty, basically.
Basically, yeah.
Okay. Is the idea that there was some special server where they had an early version of the software that was available or something?
Honestly, when I was done reading it, I was like, this is not really that consequential for the case. It's just like this little piece of evidence. And even if they prove that Craig lied, maybe that's useful in some way, but it wasn't like some smoking gun on the case generally. So
I feel like
I'm not
actually
really sure.
The opposite would be true. If it could be shown that there was actually some way he could have had access to the software, I feel like that would be that would be pretty strong evidence that there is some deliberate conspiring, proven deliberate conspiring against him.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you basically prove that this Jonathan Warren guy lied under oath to make Craig look a certain way. And yeah. Okay. So the evidence thing.
By the way, I do believe that one of the lies was about having communicated with Craig in the past during that time frame.
Yeah.
I believe there was a point where he came down very hard on no communication with Craig at all. And there were a couple of questions that were asked, some emails that were pointed out, and it looked like he was backed into a corner where there may have been some evidence that he had communications with Craig right at the time where Craig claimed to have used his service.
Now that I think about it, if the dude is out for him for a security audit, you got to have access to the software in order to audit the security in the first place.
Right. I'm trying to pull up my notes because I have like quotes with page numbers.
Steve likes to focus on a particular question and very precisely, absolutely get to the bottom of it and exhaust it.
Yes,
which hours. Is probably, you would make a good lawyer, Steve.
Probably, yes.
Let me see if I can find something here. Keep going. I'll
yeah.
read.
So as you're looking for that, so there's sort of general question about the validity of a lot of the evidence on both sides. And well, okay, I don't know which one we want to move to now, but I would like to ask your thoughts on why does so much evidence provided by Craig's side seem to be disputed by Craig's side themselves? That seems unusual to me and strange. I don't follow a lot of court cases, but that seems like an odd thing. And I guess I'm curious, why doesn't his side do more scrutiny before they submit stuff to the courts? Or is there just some massive amount of tampering going on with stuff that there's no way they could have the time to figure it out? What is your thought on why they're submitting so much stuff that they themselves later dispute?
Yeah. So in the depositions of Craig Wright, which are a fun read, you'll see he's very adamant about, I didn't submit that. My lawyer submitted that. So that's the first point. And then his main point is just, and I think, again, I'm not a lawyer, but this I think is right. In discovery, it's not, hey, submit all the information that is going to help you win. It's submit everything you have. And there's been, I think, millions of pages of documents submitted. So
and that's like a strategy often used in discovery to purposely dump absolutely everything. So you just overwhelm the opposition and give them so much to sort through.
Right. Yeah. So, if that is what you are obligated to do legally, and Craig has servers that were compromised as like he's claimed, then it's not surprising that, okay, some of the things that he's submitted because they're on his servers are fraudulent. So it follows like through that logical progression. I think most people scoff at that just because like they're starting strongly from the point of Craig's a liar. And it is like, it seems like good evidence that he's disputing his own documents he submitted. But I think that's like not a very legally informed understanding of discovery.
It's so funny because this is one of those cases that like absolutely tests the human's mind's ability to stick to logic in the face of all other feelings you have. So like if you just listen to Craig's testimonies, if you just back it out and boil it down to like a symbolic logic problem, it's like, claim A, if A is true, then B, A, therefore B, whatever. Some of these things, you can't say for sure that, oh my gosh, he must be lying because his side submitted documents that he himself says are compromised. As you said, you can give a logical explanation to how that might happen. The problem is when you hear Craig and they ask him, did you write this email? That's not an email. Yes, it is. No, that's a piece of paper. And then he goes on like this huge tangent about what is an email versus a piece of paper. Is this your email? No, that's not mine. Well, how come your side gave it to us? I didn't give it to you. My lawyer gave it to you. And then you're like, okay, everything in you is like, this guy's so crazy. He's so full of it that it's very hard to allow yourself to be like, well, logically, it is still possible that he's telling the truth. He's just telling the truth in a way that makes it so that you don't want to think he's telling the truth.
Right. And then there's two things too. So one, like he's a lawyer, so he's going to be very specific with the language and he'll like contest things like that.
Hold on. Back up. Or, he's not a lawyer.
He's a legal scholar. He has a master's in law.
I would say, okay, knowing what I know, and I'm no respecter of academia and certainly no respecter of lawyers, but I know that if you call yourself a lawyer and you don't pass the bar exam, other lawyers will be out for you. Even if you call yourself a legal scholar, that would usually be like a PhD level who actively publishes and teaches law. Like having a master's in law from a university, like, I don't know what that means. I don't know enough about the field of law, but I'm guessing what I know about academics in other professional areas. Having a master's degree in almost anything is looked at as like a joke.
Okay, I misspoke with lawyer. Let's say he cites case law more than the average person, right? So he like has an understanding of law, especially as it pertains to things like digital signatures and electronic communications.
Okay, that's my one beef with sometimes your writing will refer to all of his credentials and legal expertise. And I'm like, I feel like you're kind of taking that on faith because he's got a master's in law. Other legal experts don't seem to respect his legal expertise. Certainly the judge doesn't. And
have you read his LLM proposal? His like,
I've read a bunch of his papers.
It's like interesting. It doesn't seem like it's like a, Phoenix, University of Phoenix kind of like degree farm.
I can't tell in all these other fields that, like, when he writes about economics or something, for example, that I know something about, I can judge what I think of that. But when he's writing on law, I'm like, okay, he's referencing a bunch of cases. I don't know enough to know whether like how good his grasp of the law is. I don't have a reason to think that he's a total idiot, but I also don't have a reason to think he's an expert. So I feel like a little bit more neutral terminology there would be preferable.
I'm with you on like, being suspicious of credentialism, and Craig is kind of an interesting exception, and maybe this is like my financial bias or something, but I do think that like Craig is a practitioner in many ways too. So like he has a long history of a lot of interesting work and writing. So he's not just someone like I think of like Taleb, like criticizing academics. He's not just an academic that's all talk. Like he seems to be, especially if he invented Bitcoin, then obviously he is like a very accomplished practitioner. So I give him a little bit more leeway. And just from, engaging with his ideas and watching him enough, talking to like Ryan Charles, it's possible that he's like bamboozling everybody, but it seems like he has a pretty strong grasp on a lot of different topics. And he's led me down rabbit holes that I later do follow him down, and I can corroborate what he's saying. So I haven't really heard him say something, investigate, and then go, oh, this is total bullshit. That hasn't happened to me yet.
Yeah. Okay. So let's move to some of the evidence and some of the testimony. There's a couple things in particular I'd like to ask you about, but there's a whole bunch of different people who have testified and whatever. And I don't know if Steve and TK, you have specific questions, but I'll throw these out here. We can get to them in any order. One thing I want to ask you about was this whole tax credit thing, this R&D tax credit. I want to understand the nature of that. Is that something that like, if you qualify, you basically get free money, or is it you are getting a write-off only if you have actually spent a ton of money? Because I've heard people say that, oh, this was his scheme to try to get this free money from the tax office. And from my understanding of tax credits it's typically not like you just get a check. It's more like you prove that you spent a certain amount of money on whatever stupid thing that the tax office decides they're going to favor above other stupid things. And then they say, okay, you spent on that. That money is non-taxable. So you just don't pay tax on that. It's not like they're just giving you free money. But sometimes a tax credit can actually be like if the tax credit you qualify for exceeds the amount that you spent, you can actually get a check. So I'd like to know a little bit more about that tax credit thing. And then the other thing I was curious about, and this I think was one of the most interesting pieces of evidence, is this. It seems that Craig was able to get to use ownership of 650,000 and then 200,000 Bitcoin as collateral for some kind of fees or legal fees for filing patents or a loan of some kind at a very early date. I was really interested in that. Like, how forgeable would that be? Because if you had some other party that has a genuine interest in making sure you actually have those assets, allowing you to collateralize some kind of loan against this Bitcoin, then you would presume he had to prove ownership to them at the time, which you would presume they wouldn't be fast and loose with that amount of money, which to me seems like one of the biggest potential pieces of evidence for him actually owning those coins that I've yet seen. So those are the two things I would like to ask about in terms of evidence and testimony. But I know TK wants to talk about Andreas's testimony. I don't know what Steve wants to talk about. We can get the old uncle, the uncle who's straight out of the book Cryptonomicon. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. We could go anywhere.
Oh yeah. What was your first question again? Remind me.
The ATO R&D tax.
Oh yeah, the ATO stuff. Okay,
What's the story with that? Give us the summary.
So the best summary I think is from Connor Murray, Bitcoin and Beyond. So he has a nice Medium piece that I think we linked to in ours. And then he also has, I think, 2 videos that he elaborates on it on his Bitcoin and Beyond channel. So for like a really thorough explanation, reference that, because I think he actually got information that wasn't public to write that stuff. But my understanding is that the dispute over the tax credit, so it was money he spent. So like you gave the 2 options. There's the first one, money he spent on businesses. And the dispute was whether the money was spent on a hobby or on a business. And that dictated whether or not it was a legitimate tax write-off. So what, like the documents that we have are an amended tax return where he's trying to get more of a tax deduction from previous expenses. It's like car related expenses, which Craig actually talks about. I think it was in CoinGeek Toronto when he does like that first sit down with Jimmy, and it's like called the Satoshi Chronicles or something like that. And he talks about how like initially the nodes were set up at these like 2 areas, like a farm he had and somewhere else, and he was driving back and forth. And so it's expenses like this that he was contesting. This is work related. This is Bitcoin. This is like a legitimate thing. This is 2009. So it's kind of more difficult to prove. And the tax office was claiming it was a hobby, but he did ultimately win. So it was like a multi-year process with the tax office on this amended return. And ultimately he came out.
They agreed, okay, you've proved that this is a business. And so a lot of people look at this like a gotcha, like, oh, he just tried to spin up these businesses real quick so he could get this tax credit. I don't see it that way, just given what I know about tax code. If you're like, hey, even just as a personal filing your taxes, hey, if you can prove something's a business expense, you can write it off. Well, shit, I'm going to try to prove I drove to the airport like 10 times to go fly to give a talk somewhere. I'm going to say 10 airport trips, it's this much mileage or whatever. I bought a desk. The TV that I use in here, sometimes I use that to watch the news only if I'm on it for work.
They're going to come after you, man.
It's work expense. And sometimes that requires, oh, well, you got to spin up an LLC real quick. And then and sometimes you even do that after the fact because they're like, oh, well, we don't have this. And you're like, oh, well, hold on, I can do, this. That's not in and of itself. That doesn't seem that crazy to me. Like knowing the way that, especially if it's a new technology, knowing the way that tax offices work. But why was there a raid on his like house and everything? When was that? I thought that was related to this, that they later decided in auditing him that this was fraudulent and that they had to come do whatever governments do and kick down doors or whatever.
Yeah, that's where it gets interesting. So remember when within the past year when like Roger Stone's house was raided in Florida and like there was a CNN reporter that just was like extremely lucky, and he was camped out at like 5 a.m. at Roger Stone's house, and he'd gotten there like 2 hours before. So like a similar thing happened with this raid where like media was there, like they knew about it, they'd been tipped off. And I think the specific media people were like from Wired and Gizmodo, or maybe just one of those two, which ultimately wrote the pieces that kind of outed him. So like, this is like a point that people start to look into shenanigans, and they think there were different interests involved. And so
like he got
swatted kind of is like the story. I don't have a very robust defense of that. Like I actually haven't gone as deep down the ATO and the raid rabbit hole as some other people have. But it sounds plausible to me. And there were like one thing that Connor talks about in his piece is there were people involved in his ATO, like working for the ATO, involved in his case that were later fired or dismissed for some fraudulent behavior. So there is some like weirdness, and then especially the weirdness with the media kind of being tipped off to it. It seems like it could be something, you know, a little bit unrelated from claiming gas expenses for his Bitcoin companies.
TK, Steve, jump in. I don't want to steal all the questions.
Hey, Steve, didn't you express the possibility, correct me if I'm wrong, that maybe this was something that Craig could have set up for himself to make it look like he's some big figure?
What is this? The raid or the whole thing?
The leaking information about, hey, Satoshi lives here. You guys should.
Yeah. That seems that if one is to play out the story of him being a fraud and this being orchestrated, then yeah, I could see that.
Yeah. Is there any interpretation of that raid that does not count as a point for the He is Satoshi case?
Yeah, I mean, so it depends on how much money is being made and from what sources. But I think if you're part of some scheme, and part of the scheme is that you're going to pretend that you're Satoshi, one of the costs of that is getting in trouble with tax authorities for some period of time. I feel like that would be, and having your credibility tarnished and all kinds of costs associated with that.
So, Dave, I want to ask you about this. These are things that I thought were interesting. 2011 IP license agreement paid for with 3% of total BTC supply, which was over 200,000. And then a 2012 deed of loan documents collateralized by 650,000 BTC. Who is on the other end of these agreements? In other words, who was willing to say, yep, I think you are good for it. You have 200,000 Bitcoin or 650,000 Bitcoin, and we'll make whatever this transaction is. Was this just one of those like Craig making a transaction with another Craig-owned entity, or is this an actual independent third party?
Yes, you can see these are all on Court Listener. Let's take them one by one. So the IP licensing agreement, that's between Dave Kleiman for W&K Info Defense LLC and Craig Wright R&D. So that's with with his business partner. What does it say? It's for, I think it was IP related to the coin exchange company. The loan, the deed of loan, that was a like intra Craig deal. So that was a loan between Craig Wright R&D and Designed by Human, I think is the company, which is like the person named on that was Uyen Nguyen, who works with Craig and has been involved in several different companies. Yeah, so that was between Designed by Human Ltd in the UK, Craig Stephen Wright of Craig Wright R&D, and Panopticrypt Ltd, which is another CSW company. So a lot of these things were intra-Craig entities.
What about the 2013 contracts for equity in Bitcoin related companies in exchange for 323,000 Bitcoin?
Yeah, let me pull that one up.
Money's on somehow connected to Craig.
Yeah. So like if 323,000 Bitcoin actually moved, that's one thing. But if all of these are just, hey, look, here's a contract between me Inc. and me LLC where I
Right.
say that I own this Bitcoin, therefore I will give myself a loan collateralized by this Bitcoin to do this other thing. That could obviously be fabricated as just a way to try to show that you owned the Bitcoin, or a way to fool the tax office into saying that you're up to some business or whatever. That's not the proof that I was hoping it would be.
Yeah. So I was wrong. The 2013 is Dave Kleiman, and then the 2011 is let's see, page 20.
2011 is the W&K defense.
2011 is W&K input defense. Okay, but this will satisfy you. So maybe that's not as satisfying. But the thing, so this still makes sense in the like elaborate fraud scheme theory, but this stuff is corroborated on chain. So I don't know if you saw I told you these things are like hyperlinked into hyperlinks. In this document that's on chain, I say like, this is corroborated by chain analysis, and that links to a different document. So,
Yeah.
you know, these things say like, you have to transfer this much BTC from this address to this address by this date. And then there's all these terms, and it's Bitcoin. So like, I just looked it up on chain.
And you can see that those transactions happen, but they weren't transactions for hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin, correct?
No, they were.
Oh, they were.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, like basically the exact things outlined in the document happen, and they're reflected on chain.
The only way to fraudulently do that would be to go look at the chain and say, okay, I'm going to pick these three giant
And backdate.
and the dates that they happen. Then I'm going to go create a contract saying for that same amount, okay, now you have to do this, and I'll do this, and I'll do this. And then we can say, look, it's on the chain. And the only way to disprove that happened would be, or the only way to prove that it was fraudulent definitively would be for somebody to come out and say, nope, I was the one who made that transaction on that date.
Right.
Not Craig or Dave. Here's my, proof that it was me, and then nobody has done that to date.
So nobody's done that. One of the addresses that's in a lot of these documents is the one that starts 1FEE. And that address has been, so like, I thought like, we found these addresses and we were like, that one still has 80,000 of each Bitcoin fork in it. And we were like, oh, great, we have this like inside information. We're going to track this Bitcoin address. And then like 3 days later, Craig sent that letter to the BTC developers. And that was one of the addresses on there that he's alleging he owns, but it was the Bitcoin on it was stolen from him, and he no longer has access. So
Isn't that the same address that supposedly the Mt. Gox money went to?
That's the same one. Yeah. So there's a couple addresses that pop up all over the place. It's the 1FEE and then the 1933.
Okay. So how would this be possible? How would it be possible that Mt. Gox was hacked and all the money was moved to an address, but that's also Craig's address, and then that also was stolen from him like recently? Like, I think he claimed it was in February or something like that. I mean, are all those claims mutually exclusive?
So I don't think the Mt. Gox claim is that Mt. Gox funds were stolen and then sent to this address. There's a claim about that address being involved in Mt. Gox, but we dug into that, and there's the only evidence to suggest that that address is involved in the Mt. Gox hack, which also is kind of a misnomer. Like, prior to looking into this, I thought there was like a hack, and it was like a day. It was over the period of years that they're alleging funds were siphoned and they were siphoned off, not solvent. So it's not really a hack, which is I think important. But we dug into, because like the cryptocurrency media is talking about Craig accidentally involved himself in this theft, and there's no evidence that that address has anything to do with Mt. Gox. There's a screenshot of I think it's like a Telegram conversation between Jed McCaleb and I think Mark Capellas that mentions that address. So it's a screenshot of a text, but there's no like legal documents in Japan that are publicly available as far as I know. So if anybody knows otherwise, like please link them. But I looked into that and couldn't corroborate it.
What would Karpalus, even if Karpalus is out to get Craig or something, what would he gain from being like, hey, this address that Craig listed was this Mt. Gox address? Like, that doesn't seem like that does anything to the case against Craig as Satoshi per se. It just is a very confusing fact. So It seems like there's not a ton of incentive for him to make that up. Why would he be saying this address is involved if it wasn't involved, that, specific address? Like, is it possible that Craig was siphoning money off of Mt. Gox, finally got a ton of it and was like, hey, and I have so much money, I can claim that I'm Satoshi, but I don't want to move it and people will think that I'm a thief unless I say I'm Satoshi?
It's possible, I guess. Like, standalone, maybe that would be like a compelling theory to me. Given all the other circumstantial evidence, it's like not that compelling, but I don't have a great story for like, what is Karpeles doing here? I know that Craig basically says there was no Mt. Gox hack. Like, that was basically just some shenanigans that Mark was involved in. And, in the battle of like Craig Wright versus the cryptocurrency consensus, like, they're on the other side. So like, they're trying to smear me. I have been
kind of amazed that Karpeles is like, still kind of like out and about from when I first did a bunch of research on the Mt. Gox hack. I was like, well, it seems like Mark was just doing the shady business, or at least allowing it to be done knowingly from like pretty much the beginning. I don't know a ton about it, but
it's like his redemption arc coming back into the crypto space with the silver bullet against Craig.
So, Len Ulbricht tells the story of it seems like Karpeles was involved in Silk Road in some ways, that he might have been involved in some of the corruption that happened in the FBI Baltimore department. So Karpeles is this fascinating character, that he might be this real, clever schemer guy, but if you listen to any interviews with him, he's like the dweebiest guy ever. He's got a very high voice and talks geeky stuff all the time with a French accent, so he might be like the brilliant 5D chess guy all along.
Maybe. I don't know. I mean, that's a whole different area. It's weird, but
so you can prove that these coins moved at this time and these contracts claim that should have happened, and so that's at least some kind of circumstantial evidence, either of an elaborate fraud scheme or some real ownership.
Yeah, and it's pretty fun. If you open up that document and just click through, we hyperlinked all the things, so you don't have to type in these long Bitcoin addresses into Block Explorer, and you can kind of trace like where they go from there. So there is some interesting stuff, like the one fee address and a couple others still have a huge amount of Bitcoin, but most of the addresses that are in these contracts received them per the terms of the contract, and then they were dispersed from there. But a lot of them were dispersed in a way that looks almost algorithmic. So you'll have like 100,000 Bitcoin in an address, and it's split divided up 10 equal shares, and that process happens like 8 times, and then it's down to like a bunch of 5 Bitcoin per address, and then so there's all these Bitcoin that are flowing through this kind of interesting pattern with very specific numbers, where it looks like somebody was just kind of moving their Bitcoin around to obfuscate the ownership. So I don't even know what that means, but it's interesting.
It could be just basic coin mixing, but that's kind of how those processes work. But Isaac, you said this could be part of an elaborate scheme. I don't see where the elaborate part would be if this is part of a hoax, where it's like he saw a big transaction on the blockchain, and after the fact wrote up a contract that describes what happened on the blockchain, made a fake document to try to claim that he has ownership.
I mean, let's think about, what would the incentive be to do that first? What are you ultimately trying to accomplish? Let's say it's to get a tax credit, or let's say it's to claim that you are Satoshi, although he never brought this forward himself as evidence, that to my knowledge, until this court case, which maybe
some of it is
initiated by him, but it would be a very small piece in a much larger thing to go and say, okay, we're going to create in 2011 and 2012 or 2013, or we're going to backdate one for 2011 that tracks this 200,000, this for 650, and they're all going to be to these different parties, and they're all going to be not simple contracts. Like,
what do you mean they're
weird, complicated contracts? They're all different parties. Like, instead of just doing all of the contracts, like if you think you would make it look really plain, you'd say Craig Wright to W&K Holdings, and you do the same thing 3 times instead of each of them being weird, different, complicated, other entities that you're getting involved. This one is 4 different entities that are all part of some Craig thing. This one's 2. This one's Dave Kleiman. Like it's a fairly elaborate thing that has a lot of surface area for attack. Now, maybe that's part of the scheme. Is let's make it as confusing as possible so that even if people poke holes in one part of it, we got 10 other parts. You open yourself up very, very easily for whoever did move those coins to come out and prove it and say, no, I moved those coins. It just seems like if you're trying to prove, this would be a fairly complicated way and only one piece in a much broader story. That seems like you would want to be simpler than that or more straightforward than that.
I'm not sure how it could be more simple and done correctly, though. I mean, if you're going to make a claim that there are actually a huge amount of Bitcoin that you have ownership of, you got to come up with some addresses and some transactions somewhere, you know?
Well, it's not operationally difficult, but like the risk of doing that. I mean, whoever moved these 600,000 plus Bitcoin back then, they would have a very high incentive to dispute this. So it'd be a very, very risky strategy.
Maybe, unless it's like a criminal person who doesn't want anybody to know that it was them and they're happy.
It's possible.
Think it was somebody else.
I mean, exchanges move that amount. Those are generally the only, that I know of. Those are the only people that move that massive amount of coins. And if this is some, if in 2012 or something, they're moving a ton of coins, and then 8 years later, there's a document claiming ownership of one address and an old list. It's not like some random exchange is going to be checking out the court case documents and being like, oh, now is anybody claiming they own my Bitcoins?
Sure. Yeah. No, I hear that.
But it will, if he's trying to actually utilize that in some enforceable way to prove he's Satoshi, then it absolutely would.
Sure.
Like it's a high risk game.
I did hear, I don't know if this is true or not, maybe you can confirm. Wasn't there somebody signed a message with, there was like a miner or something, signed a message saying, actually, we own these coins and not Craig? Did something like that happen?
There was a recent, so like 145 different addresses that were on a list compiled by Steve Shatters as being potentially owned by Craig as part of the Satoshi Million.
They didn't start off saying potentially. They said these are Craig's addresses. And then when people said, no, they're not, they said, oh, we just said they were potential.
I don't think that's right. I think there was, basically the claim is like Craig is mining Bitcoin just passively. He set up all these servers. So he's not like, every time he wins a block, he's not like looking at the address it's in and filing it away. So like my understanding is he gave Shatters different criteria for like what would indicate a block reward that he had earned. And then they gave a list of what they like, and it should be, this many approximately Bitcoin. And they produced that list to the court. I don't think it's like if someone owns an address that's on that list, then Craig has perjured himself. I'm fairly certain. But back to the.
By the way, just to that point, Shatters was specifically criticized and defended himself in this Twitter or Reddit debate for whatever method he used. He said, he tried to broaden it out because Craig sent him back to do it. Because initially Craig said, I won't be able to give you that information, but the court pushed for it. And so Shatters went back and tried to come up with a broad enough methodology to let in even more possibilities. And even though that raises the possibility of error, it at least increases the likelihood that all of his addresses will be in there. And there were people who criticized Shatters for that. So this was not like an ad hoc response to someone doing a signing. They definitely said this is potentially, but it's not like guaranteed accuracy.
Right.
Let's talk about some of the testimony.
I still want to address the initial question though from Steve. So basically 145 addresses signed a message that said something along the lines of like, Craig Wright is a fraud and a liar. He didn't sign this. And then it said something like about the Lightning Network is a significant achievement.
Yeah, then it added the
ended
Lightning
with "We are
Network
all
is a
Satoshi."
Significant accomplishment. Yeah, like.
So there's a great 5D chess explanation of that.
Yeah, sure.
Which is, so Craig's been on this like battle of you can't sign something without an identity, right? So like I actually just wrote a blog about this yesterday because I was so annoyed by a CoinDesk piece. So CoinDesk wrote this blog and Peter Todd shared it, and it was, the headline is 4 experts, let's see,
Yeah, I read that piece and I remember thinking the same thing you did. Like, well, they didn't really disagree with Craig's point at all. It was orthogonal to his point.
Right.
Yeah. Four experts agree.
Four experts agree. Craig Wright's latest cryptography claims are nonsense. And okay, that's interesting. So you open it up and it's four cryptographers disagreeing with Craig on a legal point he's making about how a signature by definition has to have an identity component or else it's not a signature. And they're kind of arguing like, oh no, like the inputs and outputs compute, so it's a signature. And Craig's like, yeah, great, but it's not legally a signature because you can't anonymously sign something. So the whole piece is frustrating because they're just like not having the same conversation. But so this is like a broader point that Craig's been on, is like digital signatures, that's not just like a throwaway term. That like a signature means something in law and it has a ton of precedent. And I invented Bitcoin to be a system that has identity, and it's like part of the whole design of the system.
Like you have to be able to tie it to a real flesh and blood person. Otherwise, proof of ownership becomes based entirely on computer code, which means that if I steal your keys, I now own your Bitcoin. I can steal your identity and everything else. And if you don't have an ability to say, oh no, I can prove that he stole my coins and that they used to belong to me, the person, not just me, the address, then you are in this really weird, dangerous territory. And that's his whole law is law, not code is law thing. So
it's a whole not your keys, not your coin thing.
That Bitcoin is answer, by the way, I think.
Right. So he's like making this point that like proof of access or proof of control is not proof of ownership. These are separate things.
Which would also be convenient if he was trying to get control of coins that he never actually owned, but
it works for that. But it's also just necessary for like private property. I mean, I think like in the blog post that I wrote, I was just like, nobody would want to port this idea of not your keys, not your coin over to real world property.
Because it basically means that theft can't exist, right? Like theft as a
theft is just justified.
Actionable crime can't exist. Whoever controls the object owns the object.
Right. So you steal my car keys. Okay, you own my car now. It's like, well, no, you don't. You access my car. But I'm
or you literally forge a signature, and then somebody goes, no. If we analyze it bit by bit, this is the exact signature. Therefore, it's valid.
Right. Yeah. So that whole piece was frustrating. But I mean, the 5D chess version is Craig signed this message, and it's going to be like this egg on your face moment when he does prove both control and access to these coins, and it's like, look, you can't just believe what an anonymous signature says because there is
that's the best explanation for somebody putting in something about the Lightning Network being a significant achievement, because
it's so on the nose.
It's satire. It has
Who believes that?
Well,
I know.
There's another theory here too, which is he is, if he does own the keys, he's trying to prove that he doesn't own the keys, so that he can actually move the coins without people knowing that it's him, right? There's like two different 5D versions there.
Well, that was my like very original thought.
So he doesn't have to pay half of it to Dave Kleiman.
Right. Or tax liability or whatever. If he can get courts to declare you are not Satoshi, therefore you couldn't own these, then he's scot-free to do whatever the hell he wants with those coins because it's already been proven that he couldn't be.
It's like some double jeopardy thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be crazy. That would take me for a loop for sure. But yeah, basically that's the story of those signatures. So this message was signed, which is like, who wrote that message?
Okay.
Yeah.
I actually remember something similar happening. There was an email that was sent from one of Satoshi's email addresses, maybe in 2015 or so. And this was after one of the email addresses was hacked. There was the GMX account and another account. And I remember this was near the height of the scaling debate. And Satoshi sends out a similar message where he's like, oh, I'm so sad to see that the discussion has degraded. I never anticipated mining pools. We can't have a contentious hard fork like a Bitcoin XT at the time. And then it also made a pitch for the Lightning Network and off-chain solution. That's like fat chance.
That was Greg Maxwell all day.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. So, okay. You said that the testimony, whenever somebody testifies, we get all this buzz on Twitter and whatever with people being like, oh my God, Craig is so toast. This testimony does not make him look good. And then you said, but when you go look at it, all the testimony actually seems to bolster Craig's case. And Steve in particular wanted to question that. So
if I did say that,
examples.
I want to qualify it, because if I did say that, I misspoke in those exact terms. So the testimony bolsters Craig's claim to be Satoshi.
Okay, that's right.
I don't know if it bolsters his likelihood of like winning this court case in Florida.
Got it. Okay, so let's and hopefully Steve will come back, because I know he was dubious on this and maybe he had some specific people in mind. But I'd love to hear from you, like, of all the people who've testified so far, what do you think has been the most interesting or valuable in terms of shedding light on things? Like whose testimony made you say, oh, wow, okay, this is actually really shed some new light on Craig's claims?
I mean, I always really like the people that are arguing against Craig for the purposes of the case. So this one guy, Robert Scott Radvanovsky, who is a critical infrastructure security expert. I think he is a professor. He's like associated with DePaul University in Chicago somehow, but he's got a great track record, and he runs this this mailing list that's like 20 something years old. And he's not really like, he doesn't seem from his deposition very personally invested in the outcome of this case, but he's a guy that's known Craig since 1999 and knew him through critical infrastructure. So for the purposes of the case, his point of view is that Craig and Dave invented Bitcoin. And I think he says that Dave played the bigger role. So he's not on Team Craig. He does admit in the deposition that that's kind of just based on like his research. It's not based on any personal information. So maybe that's skewed from media bias, but he does seem like a very credible guy. He's not super invested. He's testifying against Craig in the case, but he recalls, first of all, just knowing Craig for a long time. Craig introduced him to Dave, and he recalls having a conversation in early 2009 on Skype with Craig and Dave about blockchain. So, it places him nicely in the timeline speaking with Craig, and it was enough. Like I guess you could just be talking about blockchain in 2009 and just be interested in it because he found it organically, but his confidence that they were working together, I'm sure has something to do with what they were talking about and how they're talking about it and how it's kind of played out since. So I find him to be a good read.
Steve, some of the people who have testified, you seemed to indicate earlier that like these went bad for Craig, or Craig, came out.
No, my position is I thought what was claimed is that they all supported the idea that Craig was Satoshi, and I think that's too strong a claim. Like, I don't think Antonopoulos or Gavin said anything positively on record that meant they supported the idea that Craig was Satoshi at all. Now, if you read between the lines, the fact that they were so aversive to criticizing Craig or saying that they thought Craig was a fraud, I think looks good for Craig. That they didn't condemn him looks good for Craig. But I think there was testimony, at least from those guys, that you don't walk away going, oh, these guys claimed in any positive way whatsoever that Craig is part of the Satoshi team.
Yeah, that's fair. I guess definitely for Antonopoulos. So yeah, I definitely accept that. I think Gavin, he's like more wishy-washy than he was initially when he wrote that blog post, right? So I think he's kind of been become less convinced over time. But the story that he told back then, and he does kind of corroborate that he still thinks, I forget the language he uses, but like
he said something like, because you could take one quote from there where he says, yeah, it's possible that I was duped or something like that. And that's the one everybody's like, oh, Gavin's backing down. But then he has another quote where he says, yes, it is more probable than not that I was not duped and that he actually is Satoshi. And so he's kind of claiming, I still think the higher probability is that this is actually true. And he did prove it, but it is possible that I was duped. That's within the realm of possibility, though I don't think it's as probable, is essentially how I took his full testimony.
Yeah.
He also qualified why he says that. So he said two things about that. One, he says the reason why he thinks it's possible that he was deceived is not because of what he experienced himself, but because of what he was led to believe about the public spectacle. He says that the standard of proof that he has for his own private signing is one thing, but he was also promised that there would be this follow-up, and that just never happened. And that's the element that makes him think that it's possible he could.
Which makes you feel like, okay, I was told I'm going to prove it to you, and then I'm going to prove it to everybody. You'll be vindicated. But then he was just hung out to dry. He goes on record saying it. He was never vindicated, and that makes you question the whole thing, which, you know, I think definitely explains the lack of having the same high confidence that you would have, but also saying, look, I can't deny that what I saw seemed pretty good proof to me. It just seems weird that then Craig would go back on his claim that he was going to publicly prove this.
And there also might be a necessary distinction between Gavin thinking Craig is Satoshi, whatever that means, and Gavin thinking that Craig did sign a transaction from block number 10. Because what he does say in the deposition is he was, quote, convinced that CSW had taken one of the early blocks, block 10, and signed a message using its private key. So he still, you know, thinks that what he saw wasn't fraudulent.
Well, does he say he was convinced as he's referring to his prior state? Or does he still say, I still remain convinced that that's what happened?
I think it's the latter.
Okay.
I'd have to pull it back up and take a look, though. It's on page 73 of his deposition.
Has Craig ever publicly explained why he did what he did with his public signing, coming out and saying, I'm going to sign, here it is, I did it, I proved it? And then later, other people being like, no, what you did is something that a lot of people could have done. That's phony. Has he ever explained why he chose to do something that kind of looked real but really wasn't real, instead of either doing nothing at all or actually signing? Why would you choose this middle ground sort of approach that's like obviously phony?
Yeah, I think he's indicated. I don't think he's said definitively this is why what happened. And I think there's like two factors. So there is this whole factor of Robert McGregor, who owns, I think it was at the time, N-Trust or Encrypt. And so like basically the story is like he's like acquiring a lot of what is N-Chain. And the way Craig tells it, he's kind of like, he has this vision for how they're going to do this PR campaign. And Craig's just kind of like at his whim because he purchased the company basically, or the companies. So one version is that he just like wasn't being cooperative because Craig is like kind of a dick, and he, you know, wasn't cooperating with this guy that he felt was kind of controlling him. The other version, which I think is more compelling, is just the precedent that it sets. And like Craig has been very consistent on the, you know, code is not law, law is law thing. And the idea that he would provide cryptographic proof of access to confirm proof of ownership and proof of identity, I think outside of a legal context just isn't something that he's interested in doing.
It just, I know, it just seems like he would have just not signed it then and just said that. I don't,
or maybe he changed his mind, or
proves.
Yeah. And like, I think I'd have to reread it. I haven't read that piece, but like his whole bringing up SART and that whole thing, I think he's kind of like making an allusion to this, like,
so it's possible that he sabotaged it. Like, okay, you want me to do this? Fine, I'll do it for you. And to a non-technical person who's pushing it as a PR thing, he's going to be like, great, thanks, you did it. And then only days later find out that Craig made a fool of him and, you know, showed that whatever, everybody says he's a fraud. And now this guy's plan of making this company more valuable by being able to say, we have Satoshi on our team, is screwed. Company value goes down. Now you have an opportunity to get somebody else to buy it out when this guy's like, forget it, I'm done.
I mean, it seems like a weird, like, I don't really think that that's what happened, right? I think that like is a plausible story. It seems like very weird behavior to me, although there's a lot of weird behavior in this.
There's nothing non-weird.
Who knows? But this is the key thing of all the research that we did, and kind of the conclusion of our piece is that there's a very, very clear financial incentive for him to release this bungled proof. And it's just that the Tulip Trust, if you think that this is a legitimate document and it legitimately, you know, grants its beneficiaries what it says it owns, then Craig doesn't want to prove that he's Satoshi and tank the value of his investment prior to being able to access those assets.
Yeah, I think that is one of the most compelling. And from from way back, at least a couple of years ago, maybe 2017, when I started looking into Craig more, that was like one of my first theories, was kind of what we were saying before, that it's in his interest for people to not think that he is Satoshi until maybe never, but at least until some point at which he's able to move some things without, serious ramifications. But okay, so Tulip Trust, unless you guys want to talk more about some of the other testimony, Andreas or any others.
Sorry, guys. Was I not muted there for a second?
No, you were muted.
Oh, okay. I got a weird notification.
We didn't hear you say, I'm talking to these effing a-holes over here.
No, we just got this crazy hailstorm where we're debating whether or not I got to move the car. I think I got to move the car.
Okay. Go take care of your car.
Hey, let me just say one thing about.
Now you can claim it on your taxes, moving your car.
$1 million.
Yeah.
One thing that he talked about, Craig, in one of the deposition transcripts is that he never agreed with the way those guys handle things. It was kind of like you had the money guys and the PR team, and they had their agenda. It's almost like they wanted to package him up and polish him up like he's running for president.
Yeah, take him on a road show.
Yeah, we're going to make you more PR friendly. And it sounds like he was uncomfortable with that the entire time, but he kind of went along with it. He kind of tried to be open-minded. And it sounds like he resents himself and others for just not being honest right away and saying, you know what, I think this whole thing is completely stupid. I disagree with it in every way. And I think the further he went down that path, I mean, and this is pretty much what I interpret him having said when he answered these questions in the deposition. The further he went down the path, the more ticked off he got, and the more he got to a point where he was like, I hate this circus, and I just can't go along with you anymore. It doesn't matter what I told you and what we agreed on. This is done. This is stupid. I'm out of this. I'm going to do things on my terms. Like, you guys have made me look terrible enough, and I thought I could force myself to fit into this mold and make it work, but I just can't. And it seems like there's resentment on both sides. There were some money guys that got upset because they were looking to just have a big payday from his PR moment, and it sounds like he felt like he was kind of used and like, you know what, screw you guys. I don't owe you anything. I don't appreciate how you treated me.
And you have to remember like the broader context too. So if we believe Craig's general story, he's pretty uncomfortable with Bitcoin as a project. So not necessarily in 2015 when this is happening, but definitely in 2011. And this has kind of come out more in court too. I remember when he was like physically in Florida and people were reporting on that, there was that scene where he like broke into tears and was like kind of distraught about what he had created and how it had aided in human trafficking and all these things. So like, if that's also a part of the story, and Craig is like, he wants to get back into it, he wants to save the project that he thinks was, went the wrong way, he still might be one, like morally or, ethically concerned about the project. And then two, legally concerned about ramifications of having invented it. And that's like, especially more true if you buy, and if the courts confirm like his idea that he's the issuer of BTC and whatever that, or all Bitcoin, and whatever that implies legally. So, it might've been like uncomfortable for several reasons as he's kind of being cast back into the PR, being the front man of Satoshi.
There were a lot of interesting testimonies that the Donald Lyman, his uncle, is very fascinating. Andreas is very funny just because like he's trying so hard to not say anything that remotely resembles an unequivocal statement about Craig being a bad person or a liar or a fraud, even though it's very clear from his tweets that he had said stuff like that before. He kept trying to like abstract from them and distance from them. And it was just very awkward. It was very funny. He just seemed like he was not comfortable at all. But I want to talk about the Tulip Trust. You have a little section here, and I actually want to just read it quickly because this is very interesting. Some of these dates, especially because you hear all this stuff. Oh, January, a bonded courier, and then it happens, and price spikes because Craig messages people and says the bonded courier has arrived, and then a bunch of court documents are dumped, and then nothing happens after that, and then Craig claims that everything was stolen, and he still hasn't moved the coins, and so then everybody's kind of like, oh, that was all a lie, And the Tulip Trust thing seems very sort of fishy. You got like a trust within a trust within another trust and all this structure. And every time somebody says, well, how come you can't access it? Craig has some reason that it's more complicated than anyone would ever imagine. But you have a pretty interesting breakdown here. It says one of the primary documents to be released is emerged with the Tulip Trust, a 2011 Seychelles trust that owns the rights to over 1 million Bitcoin and valuable Bitcoin-related IP. The document has allegedly been updated 4 times, with its most recent—
It's actually 3, by the way. That's a mistake.
3, okay.
Yeah.
With its most recent version dated July 6, 2017. Portions of the document remain redacted, but the readable portions give us the following key information. The trust is set up to promote the work of Dr. Craig Wright, named alongside his alias Satoshi Nakamoto, to progress the legal nature of Bitcoin and build a scaled financial system on top of Bitcoin that can achieve over 1 trillion transactions per second. Doesn't say anything about the Lightning Network being a significant achievement. The trust grants its trustees access to Wright International Investments and Tulip Trading Assets. Wright International Investments, the Satoshi million Bitcoin mined before 2010, can only be spent after a full meeting of members between the dates of December 2019 and the end of 2020. So they basically have like a full calendar year to meet and then be allowed to spend this Satoshi million. Tulip Trading Ltd, any recoverable assets owned by CSW related entities, including the Bitcoin purchased in 2011, which originally capitalized in the companies. The trust has an activation date of January 2020. So that's when the trust becomes active, I guess. I'm not sure exactly what that means. The trust was set up by CSW, but access to the document was explicitly withheld from him during the period of July 10th, 2017 until December 15th, 2019. So apparently then he got access to the documents about this trust. CSW will be able to become a trustee by a vote of members only after June 2020. Okay, so we have a strange structure with a couple dates. Supposedly sometime before the end of 2020, the members of a full meeting of the members, they can move those coins. I don't know that they have to from reading this, but they can. CSW can become a member if the other members vote after June 2020. So it's possible they've already voted him a member. Maybe not, but they can. And then it's possible that with or without him as a member, or do they need him as a full member first, they can then move these coins, or do they have to move the coins by the end of 2020?
So here's the language. I'll read it from the trust. So it says—
Oh, you think that's going to make it more clear than your synopsis of
well, it's confusing because the full meeting of the members is just a thing that has to happen. And after that meeting of the members, if it's after these dates, then they can make Craig a trustee, and they can have access to the Wright International Investments.
Okay, so the meeting has to happen, and the other things are optional activities they can take, but only after this meeting has happened if they want to.
Yeah, so the Wright International Investments holdings, which are the Satoshi million, they may not be used, encumbered, nor otherwise made subject to any dispossession prior to a full meeting of the members in the period between December 2019 and late 2020. So it sounds like there's one meeting that has to happen, and it can happen now because it's after June.
Do we know who the trustees are?
Yeah.
They're all dead.
They're all, yeah. So Ramona Watts, or Ramona Eng, and Craig Stephen Wright are the grantors, settlers, and beneficiaries. Ramona Eng is the primary trustee and protector. Dennis Bozere Mayaka, who is I think he's in Kenya. He's like a lawyer in Kenya. He's a trustee. And then
he's
Craig
the
Wright,
Kenyan lawyer everyone keeps talking about.
Kenyan lawyer. And then Craig Wright after the supermajority.
Why does that make you laugh, TK?
It's just funny, man. The whole thing is just so hilarious.
It's crazy.
Know? So wait, so does Ramona and the Kenyan lawyer need to have a meeting? The two of them need to get together for coffee?
Yeah, I guess so. There's a lot of weirdness about it too. And Ramona's deposition is really interesting because she says that she helped set up the initial trust. So that was 2011. They weren't married at the time, but the beneficiaries are like their family. So that's like a strange, I'm not sure the timing on that, or maybe like they were dating, and I don't know, but she's been involved in this trust process since prior to their marriage.
Is she, so she's Craig's current wife?
Current wife, yeah.
Okay.
But they had worked together prior. So they were like work associates, and then they got married.
Got it. So he was like, hey, we're dating. I tell you what, let's set up this trust. This is my way of showing my future commitment to you. We'll give $1 billion to our kids.
Yeah, I mean, my crazy 5,000D hopscotch idea is that they're not even really married. It's just like some spousal privilege thing, but they have children, and that's like totally crazy. But that would be kind of that'd be the movie plot if this.
Yeah, that's not a red flag. You're dating this guy, claims to be Satoshi. You might inherit a few $1 billion, and he's like, look, if time ever comes, there's this Kenyan lawyer.
And he's got a great Twitter account.
Call him up.
Has the Kenyan lawyer been deposed?
Wait, he's got a great Twitter account? What is it?
It's just like not active, but like it's just like a very weird thing. He's not like a polished lawyer. He's like like he has a website. I think I found the website through his Twitter account. And maybe it's a different guy, but it's like also a lawyer in Kenya. I think it's Kenya. It's like it's totally crazy.
What, has he been deposed or anything? Like, what's his story?
He hasn't, but I think he might be on the list of witnesses they're going to call. I have to double check that, but there's a whole list of people and like the dates.
So
periods.
Nobody knows anything about him.
I know very little about him. Yeah, his name comes up in several depositions, but I know very little.
Has Craig or the other trustee, I forgot her name, his wife, have either of them given an explanation for who he is or why he's a part of this?
I think in Ramona's deposition, she talks about it a bit, but like nothing that's coming to mind. So it wasn't like super enlightening. But like, I mean, so I've said already, I'm not a lawyer, but like, we're not just
what if it's like Kaiser? What if it's like Kaiser Soze and like Craig is actually from Kenya? He's the Kenyan lawyer.
I'm open to it. Or it's just Kevin Spacey, like it's that Kaiser Soze.
But you feel pretty confident from reading your, in the possible outcome section and kind of the way you're thinking about investments. You feel pretty confident that these coins are going to move before the end of 2020 based on your reading of these Tulip Trust documents.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the trusts are fake, right? I think that would be like another very risky move. I mean, it has like a Seychelles registration number, and like I'm sure that's not public. I tried to like see if you could look into that stuff. As far as I know, it's not. I'm sure that's very easy to do through the courts. So I think it's legitimate. That said, we've shown this to lawyers, and we've talked to the lawyers, and they say like this is a very weird document. So it's not like a boilerplate Seychelles trust, if that exists.
It's because Craig is a legal scholar, and he just knows how to make legal documents, weirder than the rest. I don't know.
It is, yeah, it's weird. And it's been updated several times. So yeah.
In like suspicious ways?
No, so like, and you can see in this document, it just says like what it owns. And one of the things it owns is like the old Tulip Trust. So I think that's how you like roll over a trust into a new document.
So basically like, okay, now we have additional holdings since the last time. Let's like create a new trust and throw the old trust into it, since the old trust is locked up until a certain date. We'll enfold it in the new trust and also include some additional stuff. Yeah,
if you just want to change the terms, I think maybe that's standard. I'm not sure. The lawyers we spoke to didn't say that was weird. I'm not sure.
I think this whole thing would gain so much more credibility if there's any connection outside of Craig, his wife, Calvin. These small people that seem to have. They've set up all of these trusts among one another, these nested companies inside of each other. And there's a document that says, there's 500,000 Bitcoin that was given to a loan to Craig from Craig or Dave. It's like any connection outside would be really valuable.
So like there's a lot of like intra Craig things, but there is the interface with like other people too. So some of those are like, this deal Craig had with this guy, Mark Ferrier. He was supposed to get, it involved like some gold stuff and then also some IP, some banking IP that was somehow like related to some Saudi banks or something. And he like had this big transaction and the guy was kind of a scammer and made off with it. And there's information about Mark Ferrier online, unrelated to this. The other good piece of information is Craig. Everything is so crazy. Craig was working with this like Panamanian law firm or something. and they were handling a lot of the Bitcoin that was purchased by Craig. So the stuff that was held under Tulip Trading Ltd was kind of like a tree of entities. And a lot of the Bitcoin was being managed, or like, I'm not sure like what really they were doing, but they were interfacing with this company called High Secured in Panama. And ultimately, this woman who you can see Craig emailing back and forth with, or people working for Craig's entities emailing back and forth with, her name is Ritzella de Gracia. And she, I guess, stole like 100,000 Bitcoin from Craig. And he says, you know, like, oh, it was a huge mistake working with High Secured. Like, he's like very displeased with his time working with them. And I did look it up, and I found a Chicago Tribune article about how High Secured's executives were arrested for money laundering. And it was like contemporaneous to the stuff. And he said, you know, like, yeah, this company eventually went kaput because of money laundering stuff, and it was a mistake to work with them. And I did corroborate that just through the Chicago Tribune. So there is things where he's sending, and I think part of those documents with High Secured, there are on-chain like receipts. There is corroboration on-chain that payments
that would be interesting,
were made.
yeah.
So I can look and I can send you something after this and take
That'd be
a look.
great.
Yeah. What a couple of things that like seem to come out of the blue were, well, one, he mentions, and I don't know if this was prior to the court case, but it's when I first heard about it. Craig seems to say at one point that it was him and Dave Kleiman and David Reese, who's now deceased, I guess. And I haven't really heard anything else about David Reese. And then in the court case, he's kind of like, well, no, it was really just me, and I just asked Dave some questions from time to time. But I haven't really heard much about the David Reese involvement. And then this other guy comes up in this court case that he was working with this like British spy who got killed by like
Was
a
it
Russian
Garrett?
agent.
Or Garrett?
Yeah.
Gareth Williams? Yes.
Pick one, David Reese or this Garrett dude. What is the story with these?
So Gareth, I looked into a little bit. The person to talk to would be another guy. I kind of like outsourced that to somebody else. So one of our advisors went down that rabbit hole, and he said it was just kind of crazy and he couldn't really make heads or tails of it. But the like interesting thing there, I mean, to me, that kind of nested nicely into Craig's uncle's deposition, where he kind of paints this picture of like the Wright family is like a military intelligence family. And, you know, Craig's uncle, this guy being deposed, he was like a very high ranking Air Force guy in Australia. And he was working with all these IT systems for them and for the US. And then his father, Craig's grandpa, he was like in Douglas MacArthur's inner circle, and like all these crazy connections.
Yeah, that's the Cryptonomicon guy. Really, literally, if
Right.
you read the book Cryptonomicon, it's like, you know, working with MacArthur in Australia on the code breaking team to crack Enigma with cryptography. And he's like, oh yeah, that was my grandpa.
Yeah, and like, I mean, it's Craig's uncle, so maybe he's lying, but like he seems very credible. He's like 80 years old. He seems very sharp, and he had really good recollection of things. But if that is kind of true, one of Craig's depositions, or maybe it was also in his uncle's deposition, he kind of just mentions like connections were made to help Craig get in touch with people in the UK and like in intelligence. And this is like,
And why? Why was he trying to get in touch with intelligence people?
I think for Bitcoin. So like the way that Craig talks about it, you know, this is like a tool for law enforcement to trace crime. It's going to make crime much harder, money laundering, things like that, human trafficking. So if that's true and Bitcoin is the tool to do that, then it makes sense that he would want to get, or definitely if he has like family connections that he could leverage, get in touch with these people and talk to them about it.
But then after deciding you're going to work with law enforcement and intelligence to create something to help them crack down on criminals, then you would go and release it to cypherpunks and, you know, mailing list of people who want to evade government law and then later regret that you did that. Like that seems a little.
It's not a great move, you know. I think that was probably a regret of his. I do think it's somewhat overstated that Craig like released it, or Satoshi, let's say Satoshi released this to people that were of this ideological perspective. One thing that I found really interesting was just the timing on the collapse of former e-monies and things like e-gold, you know, happening right before Bitcoin's release. So you can kind of see like an organic, just like a crazy coincidence of timing that people would gravitate to this like new attempt. So I don't think it's necessarily true that Satoshi released it. And maybe, or if Derek was here, maybe he would have some great quotes to pull up. But
I mean, it was on all of the mailing lists and discussed among all the cypherpunks that had been around.
But what's the thing that Craig,
decades.
he draws a distinction between the cryptography mailing list and the cipher. There's a cypherpunk mailing list also. And he says like, no, I released this to the cryptography mailing list and half of the people on there are working in intelligence. It's not this anti-government community.
But I mean, Hal Finney, for example, was somebody who seemed to be involved early on, and he seemed to have pretty anti-government views. I mean, I think a lot of the earliest people
what they saw in it was peer-to-peer bypass. I mean, it included in there was banks get bailed out by the Fed, right? That's right in the first block. So it's like, hey, this is a way to get off of fiat money, get away from Federal Reserve control, peer-to-peer transactions across borders, which were not really possible at the time, like they are a little easier now, where you can, completely evade any, like immediately that's where your imagination goes. And that's where everybody who put in the initial work on it, that's what all of them were doing it for, because they saw this, this global non-government money structure.
Yeah. I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me. And definitely in retrospect, given the direction that it's gone and the community that's developed around it, it like very much makes sense that that's what it was. But I don't think it's necessarily true starting from day one. And also, have you heard Craig's point? I thought this was really interesting the first time I heard it, about why that headline was included in the first block.
I have, but I read an article where he explained it, but now I forget.
So, and this is like very simple and it makes a lot of sense to me, but it just never occurred. He's saying like, well, he does have like an explanation of the contents of the article, but the thing that was interesting to me was really, it was just a way to timestamp that this is the date that Bitcoin started. And that's a very common way to do it, is to take, like you want to document that a photograph was taken at a certain point, you put the New York Times in it, and it just confirms that it couldn't have predated it.
And it was just a coincidence that it was an article on banking?
No, so Craig does, he like has the story, and I can't like really do a good version of it, but I think that it is interesting that it's just a way to timestamp things also.
I think, to play devil's advocate myself here, I think there's also, if you're looking for people to work on a project like Bitcoin, it's not like you have a whole bunch of available options outside of the cypherpunk community. So it could be that if you're looking for volunteer help, those are the people you recruit, even if you have a different political philosophy from them.
Yeah, and I think,
but if you love government and intelligence so much, and you have all these connections, why don't you just go right to that community immediately and be like, hey, work with me on creating this new.
Who's going to release it though? I mean, if you release it to the cypherpunks, that seems to get, it seems like it'd be a lot more credible than if the NSA says, hey guys, why don't you guys start using our new digital currency?
Right. I also think Craig's like love of government is overstated, and it's kind of become this like anti-government versus pro-government battle, and that kind of encourages people to like become more extreme in their position. I do think that Craig is like, he is aligned with a lot of the ideology of libertarianism. I think like Jack wrote a piece on why, I think it was called Why Craig Wright Triggers Anarchists, and he like describes Craig as a minarchist. And we kind of started that conversation last time we were on, but didn't get into it. And I would love to hear you guys and Jack talk about that. But I do think like, and one thing that Craig says is, I would have been fine with people using Bitcoin to, provide banking for marijuana dispensaries because they weren't able to access banks. But like, you guys just went too far, and we're doing heroin markets explicitly on Bitcoin Talk. Like that's the forum post, like a heroin market or a heroin store. So like, when it's so extreme, I think Craig pushes back on it, but I don't think he is celebrating law and order to the extent that has kind of become
to the
like
extent that he
persona.
says he is. No, I mean, it's a new thing for him, right?
Yeah.
His rhetoric is just like absurdly pro-government lately in a way that feels like he's just reacting and
did Isaac freeze for you guys
at other people. And so like,
well, so how do you interpret this though, when Isaac is coming back? Oh,
You're good.
Okay. I can hear you now. Well, I was gonna kind of make up your question. How do you incorporate the fact that he seems to have changed his position on government and tracking? Like I remember him giving a talk, I think it was, I don't know, it was in BCH or the early BCH days, where he says something akin to, oh, we're going to screw these chain analysis companies. You guys aren't going to be able to track your Bitcoin Cash. And like, we're going to give the finger to the people that are trying to use Bitcoin to track. Do you think that was just posturing for the audience, or do you think he changed his mind?
I think it's possible. I mean, yeah, it would be a weird alliance to make, just like for strategic reasons, which is one possible explanation. That would be kind of strange given how adamantly opposed he is to it now. I also do think, I mean, maybe not on the timeline of like 2017 to 2020, but on the timeline of early or like late 90s when he's on those mailing lists arguing with Julian Assange, to today, I think he's probably like changed his opinions on a lot of things, it seems like. And that like wouldn't be shocking since he's, even though we're not credentialists, he's doing all this learning about law and how technology can interface with it. So I think it's possible that it's like a simple explanation of he's changed his position. And then I think also there might be some strategic alliances he's made that maybe later he's regretted, but I don't have a great answer. I'm not sure.
It seems very much like, who your enemies are. Like that, okay, the people that are attacking you, whether they mean it or not, they're cloaking themselves in, whether it comes to arguments for small blocks or arguments against whatever you're doing, they're cloaking themselves in, libertarian rhetoric, and they're doing it in a way that you're just like, no, you're wrong. That's not how Bitcoin works. It's not actually, and then it makes you go the other direction just to distinguish yourself from, like, it feels like he's like, sounds way different and more pro-government than ever because he's so irritated at these other people. But it still seems very confusing to me. And I posted this question on Twitch and Powping recently, like, okay, BSV fans, Craig as well, what would you do differently in terms of introducing Bitcoin? Because the way he talks, it's like, it doesn't square with, and I did hear him say in a recent interview for the first time ever, something that sounded somewhat like I might have made a mistake at some point in my life. He said that he abdicated and he shouldn't have abdicated. And that's sort of what caused things to go a direction that he didn't like. But just that early, the way that it was introduced and framed, and like, even though he's like, we should be careful about WikiLeaks, there was no indication from early Satoshi things. There wasn't indication that Satoshi was this rabid anarchist, but there was no indication that there was any discomfort at all with efforts to use Bitcoin in sort of a let's work outside of government type of way and just exchange with each other. There didn't seem to be any discomfort with that, and there didn't seem to be any effort. Like the way he presents it now is, what you do is you go meet with governments and you work with them and you work with banks to do this. And like, why wasn't there any of that from the beginning? Maybe his mind has changed, but I've just never heard him own that. He always seems to try to pretend like they're the same. Oh no, I always have been saying this. And it's like, no, just say that you've changed, because it's clear that it's not the same thing.
Yeah. I just discovered a quote the other day from Satoshi where it's on a thread. He's talking about somebody is theorizing about how extreme you might prune the blockchain to effectively, like, maybe you don't even need a blockchain going back very far at all, which would help privacy. And Satoshi's like, oh, that's a really interesting idea, blah, 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 blah. He thought it couldn't be done for particular reasons, but he said, this is a really interesting thread. So that was, and like there are some chains like Mumble coins that are kind of trying to do something similar, and that's extreme privacy. It's about as private as you can get. And he was talking favorably about it.
Here's an interesting point, I think also. Totally slipped my mind. It was interesting though. Hold on.
While you're thinking about it, I wanted to jump in, Isaac, when you said he maybe admitted he made a mistake. Well, that's a very particular type of admission to say, I might have made a mistake in giving control to other people. I myself, were I more involved and I'm making the decision. I underestimated
how important I was to the project.
Exactly. It's like you go into the interview and it's like, for a job, what are your flaws? Well, I work too hard and I do everything correctly.
Here's the point I remembered. So another good example of things that like look bad for the court case, but I don't think really weigh in on Craig not being Satoshi, is access to the Satoshi email. So the deposition of Craig Wright, or I think it's like the second one, I don't remember, but one of his depositions and one of the depositions of Jimmy Nguyen, they're very contradictory on who had access to the Satoshi emails, and like, did Dave have access to one and Craig the other, or did they like switch? And like,
Wilson,
or maybe somebody else. And Craig's claim now is like, no, it was just me. I was using them. But Jimmy says contradictory things, and I think it is possible that, like, I'm not like the Craig Wright defender. I think it is possible that Craig is lying as parts for strategic reasons in this case. And it's possible that, maybe there was other Satoshis that were more ideologically interested in something like privacy a la Mimblewimble. And now he kind of has to own that because he's like lied to benefit him some way in this case, but it's getting confusing because it's a lie and it's hard to keep track. So I'm open to that possibility.
You have any oh, go ahead, TK.
TK will come to Craig's defense.
Yeah. Let me help out here. So I think Craig has a demonstrated ability, and I'll give an example of this, of saying two different things to two different audiences for two different purposes that sound absolutely contradictory to people on the outside, but he totally sees it as the same thing, and he won't apologize for it. He'll double down on it if you challenge it. Let me give what I consider to be a relatively non-incriminating example. Let's take the way he talks about Dave Kleiman. If you look at the initial reach out to Ira, when he lets Ira know who he is, he talks about Dave as if he couldn't have created Bitcoin without him. When he makes the video about Dave, he talks about Dave like, this is my friend. This is a guy that helped me keep it together and was an indispensable part of everything I did. The way he talked about him outside of that court case made it sound as if he held him in the highest esteem. This was his homeboy, and this was a guy that really helped him out. Then, when he gets in the court case, it almost sounds on the surface as if he's throwing his best friend under the bus. He talks about Dave as if Dave had like no knowledge whatsoever about anything remotely connected to Bitcoin. It was like, yeah, he helped me out with some stuff, but I could have asked anybody, to help me out with the same thing, and they could have done as equally good of a job. No degrees, no knowledge required for any of this stuff. And on top of that, he had a drug problem. And so when you listen to it, it sounds like two contradictory messages. The first time, he loves Dave. Dave was indispensable. The second time, it's like, guy with a drug problem, didn't know anything about Bitcoin. But I think for Craig, it's like the first time, his point was to just talk about what his friend meant to him and to kind of sell what this guy's life meant. But then when he's in the courtroom, he's defending himself against the claim that his best friend, who he loves very much, was ripped off by him, and deserves all this credit for his creation. So you've got two different audiences and two different purposes for talking about Dave, and it makes it sound contradictory. But I think for Craig, he's just telling the truth and emphasizing that aspect of the truth based on the context of the conversation. And I think he does that a lot. And if you read the transcripts for Jimmy's depositions, that's exactly how Jimmy describes him. And that's exactly like why Jimmy says he's been so important, because he's the one that can kind of translate him in that way. But that's kind of a non-incriminating example of how he does it. And so I think with the law thing, when you look at how he was talking to the earliest group, he talked exactly like he needed to talk in order to get all of those people mobilized around him, excited about Bitcoin, and it worked. Mistakes notwithstanding, it worked. And now, who's this audience? He's not talking to the anarchists now. He wants to disassociate from them. He doesn't even need them anymore. He's talking to people that he believes need to hear it in that way in order to place their faith in something when they've been turned off by the anarchist narrative that isn't useful for him anymore. And I think for Craig, it's just like, whatever subject he's talking about, he's just all in on that. And it almost makes it look like the things he said in the past, he doesn't even, give attention to, because it's based on his audience, his purpose for talking in this context.
I think that's a great framework. And I think it also could potentially be exaggerated by personality disorders. So he talks about, and like, it's part of the case now, is his Asperger's. So maybe that's even a portion of that. It's like, this is my objective. This is what I'm trying to do. And there's like little nuance, and you can flip from Dave Kleiman is essential to Dave Kleiman is a drug addict seamlessly, just because like he is accomplishing his objective. I think that's interesting.
I think
he did this with Hal, by the way, right? Like Hal Finney, yeah, he helped me out with some stuff. Hal Finney never understood anything about Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also compatible with him actually being on the side of the anarchists or the side of law enforcement. So it depends on what you can actually get away with Bitcoin. Like I don't see a way that mixing coins can really be prevented from a technical standpoint. Maybe you can make a law that says coin mixing is illegal or something. But if you wanted to be the Manchurian candidate, then you first appeal to your base and you get all the anarchists and libertarians excited. And you go, okay, well, now we're going to take this amazing technology right into the mouth of the beast. And we're going to tell the government, hey, look how great things you can do, all this tracking and blah, blah, blah. And it's a tool for law enforcement. But like at the end of the day, maybe it's libertarian. Or the other possibility is the exact opposite, that you try to honeypot all the libertarians and anarchists on the technology, and then you take it to the government and you say, ha, here's all of your mischief makers, track everything they do and throw them in jail.
The carrot.
You go in without a clear strategy, and you just see how things unfold. And once you realize, hey, I've got all these criminal types here, and the government might end up coming after me too. Maybe I'll just go to them instead and start working with them and say, oh, I can help you track and crack people down based on Bitcoin. And then, you just see where it leads you. Dave, let's bring it home back on this court case. So what happens next? The case has been delayed until October, I think it is.
October 13th, yeah.
And then what's going to happen? I mean, is this thing going to just drag on for years and years? Like, what's the most likely? Are we done with deposition and now it's actually going before a jury, or what comes up next?
Yeah, so everything's over. So we're just waiting on the jury trial. And this most recent delay was coronavirus related. It wasn't due to anybody asking for extension. So it should have been, I think initially it was July 6th. And then I think IRA extended it to August 31st. And now it's October 11th or 13th.
October 11th is my birthday, so this would be great. It'd be a great birthday present.
It could be great, yeah. So this is a key thing too. It's unclear to us to what extent assets that Craig claims ownership to would be frozen during the proceedings. So like, to me, it sounds plausible that he can't really access or sell or do any of the things he wants to do until he's granted ownership through the courts. But we've also talked to lawyers that say like, no, it's not necessarily the case. He could, dump everything right now. And then if he loses, he just owes IRA this dollar value of assets. So we're like open to the possibility that tomorrow morning, they had this meeting today of the members, and tomorrow morning they're going to dump things. So I think that that's possible. And for our purposes,
if he owed IRA a dollar value in assets, that would basically be impossible, because if you start moving those coins, there's no way they're going to be worth the current estimated value. Like, that's what's such a misnomer, saying he has 10 billion. Like, no, if you actually went to sell those, God knows what that would drop to.
That's a great point that Kevin Pham brought to my attention. Is he was looking at the different CEOs of nChain. So he was like, they brought in Jimmy Nguyen to be the CEO, and he's got this like IP strategy, and that's his background. And now they have a guy that his background is in banking, and I forget the details, but the way Pham describes it, he's like, this is a guy that, you'd want to bring on your team if you're looking to exit a big position and do it in a way that maximizes your value. And that's kind of aligned with his background. So it's possible that that is part of the strategy for their hiring. But yeah, one thing that's clear is that Craig has said, and it's part of the trust, is that they're going to try to maximize the value of their assets, and they want to use it to do all the things he lists, promote the legal nature of Bitcoin and do all this funding for Western ideals and education around the third world and all this stuff. So I think he's going to do it in a way that makes most sense, and that could be before the trial or could be after. But it's also possible that the trial ends and it's appealed.
Law school in Kenya to train Kenya.
There's going to be so many law schools in Kenya. It's going to be crazy.
I was going to say, like, if he ever posts a selfie from Kenya, everybody has to sell all their coins. Right. That means the group got together and now the dump is coming.
Well, it's funny because so Calvin went to Switzerland last week, and we're just like, oh, Switzerland, interesting. Why is he there? I think he's just wakeboarding a lot, but I don't know what he's doing at night when he's not wakeboarding. So we're on like Carmen Sandiego watch right now.
Mm-hmm.
But it's possible that this case is resolved, quote unquote, and then it's appealed. And then what happens, So the way that Craig talks about it, he's like, no, I'm not going to have, he knows that appeals exist. So he's saying like in 2020, I'm only going to have BSV.
He also said, I will never appear on camera again before appearing on camera hundreds of times. And I guarantee with 98.7% accuracy that BSV will be $1,200. So him saying that the court case is going to be done, we've won.
0.03%, man.
Yeah.
We were just in there. He was right. We were just in that point.
Yep. We were in there. Hey, that's a possibility. That is a possibility.
Yeah.
Okay. So you feel pretty confident that once it actually starts up in October, the jury trial, that you think that things will get a verdict coming out of that, in a month or two or however long jury trials take.
It's a 2-week trial calendar or whatever. So, I think that there's a chance, and there's some like disagreement within our fund, but I think there's a chance that he might like do something like cryptographically sign in court, because now it's in a legal context and he feels better about proof of access as evidence, but not as the end all be all.
This is going to be like the trying on the glove in the courtroom.
Exactly.
It's going to be a big moment,
Yeah, it'll be fun. So I think that's possible, but yeah, like I said, I also think it's possible that something happens sooner. And putting on my investor hat, like we're thinking about this all from an expected value point of view. So we think that there's maybe it's a small probability, but the upside is massive. So we're structuring trades that, and even some trades like options trades, deep out of the money options that, most of the time they're going to fail, but in the event that they're successful, it's going to be massive returns. And we're totally satisfied to put these trades on at different dates for options and have them not pan out. And we think it's like the highest EV trade we've ever made.
I'm trying to think of if it's done with SegWit, you must acquit or something. I don't know. I don't know what good. TK can come up with something for us here.
What's the platform or how are you guys making option trades on PSV?
So it's
if
all,
you can reveal that.
Yeah, it's all like OTC. I'm actually not, there was some change where recently, like we have our fund offerings now on our website, and because of some legal reason, we're able to do that. I don't know how much I can say, but if you're curious personally, like reach out and we'd be happy to talk to you.
You had Craig Wright look over it with his legal background, and he gave you the okay.
But they're thin markets, and like options on crypto is expensive because it's just so volatile. So BSV, the markets aren't super deep, but we've found some really good trades, and I wish I could say more. I'm not sure how much I can.
Dave, I got to hand it to you. You're so unflappable. Like, I poke fun at some of your arguments. I say outlandish things. I try to get a rise out of you, and you just keep plowing straight ahead. It's like you won't take my bait. I'm impressed.
Appreciate it.
So, guys, let's end it with, what are your predictions for this case? And I'll start. I'll just say, I don't know in what way, but I don't think it will be resolved in October. I think we will have some continual additional something, leaving things in a state of unresolved for an extended period. TK,
what are you talking about? The court case or the Satoshi question?
Okay. Both. TK? You're muted.
Yeah, I just don't think the most interesting things for Bitcoin SB are going to come from this case. And I think there are a lot of people that are going to get wrecked because they're hoping for something interesting to pump their bags. And I just don't think it's going to happen. It's fun gossip. I plan on keeping up with every inch of it. I plan on reading every transcript. I plan on being part of all the speculative discussions. But I genuinely don't believe anything interesting for BSV is going to come out of these cases.
So you're telling Dave that his whole investment thesis is screwed. He's going to get wrecked.
No, I don't hear him saying that. I don't hear him saying that we should count on BSV like being really valuable because of the court case. I think,
but it's a part of your
in
strategy.
the network.
But if it actually comes out that Craig, let's say Craig does the dramatic thing and signs in court, and wow, he is Satoshi, and now the coins are moving, and he's buying BSV with BTC. You don't think that would pump the price?
Hey, it would be a lot of fun, and you won't see me here expressing any negative opinions about it, but I don't see anything like that happening in 2020. I just don't believe it.
But it's not even just that.
So you don't think that there will be any kind of pump in 2020, almost regardless of what happens with the court case?
There may be, because of interesting things on the network, like the EHR data stuff that we talked about. There could be interesting moves like that. But with the court case, here's what I think is going to happen. I think there's going to be more delays, just like there have always been. And I think by the time we get to December 2020, there's going to be a whole bunch of stuff being debated, and this court case is going to be pushed into 2021. I think that's going to be a long thing, and I don't think there's going to be anything in 2020 from this court case that's going to make BSV pumps. If it pumps, it's going to be.
And finally, in 2021, after all this stuff, maybe 23, there'll be like a verdict about to come down, and an asteroid will destroy the Earth.
Yeah, that's right.
Steve?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you guys. I don't think anything is going to come from it, maybe ever. I mean, if I had to put all my money on it, I would say I think they're probably going to have, I think it's going to be anticlimactic. I think they're going to like settle at the last minute, or it's going to be totally obfuscatory. I feel like making predictions that nothing is going to come of Craig Wright's antics has always paid off so far. So I just continue to make that bet. Now, that being said, I would love to see the most epic finish, which would be the signing in court, the coins moving. I mean, I just think that would be like multiple Hollywood productions. You know, money's going to be made. BTC's going to be screwed, which is delightful. That would be amazing. I just don't think it's going to happen.
I think it actually might be the reverse. It might be coins move, because he doesn't want to like sign in court and then instantly, the price crashes. So it might be coins move and then he signs the next day or something to like put the cherry on top.
Yeah. So there's a question. The coins have moved, but who moved them? And then the next day he gets to say it was me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I got your Cochrane phrase right here. If the keys sign, the Bitcoin is mine. Or here's another one. You could say, if the judge decrees, BTC, you must agree.
They're both in consideration.
Dave, bring it home.
Yeah, so I agree with you guys. I mean, one thing I want to make clear is we're not like betting the farm on. So we write in the piece that we think there's a high probability that something will happen before the end of 2020. By no means have we bet the farm on it. Like I said, this is a probabilistic thing. We think it's totally asymmetric, and we're fundamentally long this asset anyway. So just having direct exposure to the asset is great. And then other things we can do with derivatives or options, even better. I think that there is a high probability, like we said, that something will happen that will not so much as like beyond a shadow of a doubt prove. I think a lot of people are, for a lot of people, this is not a falsifiable claim that Craig isn't Satoshi. But I do think a lot of the information that's already been presented can be packaged and delivered very nicely by a favorable ruling or something happening like a cryptographic signing or dumping a bunch of BTC. And we're excited for that, obviously, because our trades would work out. But I think the main thing is just people paying attention to the space. So like I mentioned right when we started, we're taking meetings with people, and it's just like the elephant in the room is so hard to get around. And I think the technology is so interesting. And I think things like EHR data or, any of these applications that are being made are interesting to people, but the barrier to seeing that is just so high because of the craziness. So I want our trades to crush it, but I also just want developers looking at BSV and building things. And I think that'll be the main benefit of a resolution, which hopefully is soon. And if not, I think like long run, everything's great still. It's a longer burn, and we're going to have to wait for these big enterprise level things to come out and the transaction ceiling to keep rising. But even as we sit here, like we saw 3,000 transactions per second on Bitcoin a couple weeks ago. And like, that's awesome. That was like impossible very recently. So I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic about the short run. I think it's a great trade probabilistically. And if not, we're on the Bitcoin train for the long run. So
yeah, it's funny. There's a kind of purgatory that just keeps sort of persisting. It's like, I would rather either have this thing just blow up into some glorious explosion or just go away, because it's this middle ground where you can't pretend that Craig Wright in his court case is irrelevant to BSV, but it's also not making any humongous impact necessarily on BSV. It's just kind of like there that can't be ignored. So
especially when you're managing a fund too, because like we have just like a liquid fund, we have an options fund, but we also have like our main venture fund, and it's there's a lot of great projects that we're talking to, but the calculus is much harder when you think the price of BSV might skyrocket soon to take your BSV position and allocate it to equity. So like we've always said, long run, like we want to be a venture fund. We don't really want to have a BSV position. Whatever the equilibrium price is on this asset, like we want to get there and write it up and then start seeding all these great new companies.
Yeah, I feel like resolution, honestly, in either direction would be great. If he's proven to be Satoshi, great. If he can be proven and made a mockery of in court, and everybody goes, aha, he's a great fraud, okay, and it's over, that would also be great in the long run too, because we can move past it and be like, hey, look at the underlying technology. It's something you can build on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Gentlemen, this was a blast, as always. This one's going to be a Streamanity exclusive just for the nerdy insiders, so we'll see you there.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, guys.